The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Rosemary Penwick noticed it first because of the seal, thick burgundy wax, pressed with a crest she had only ever seen in newspapers. She had been standing at the narrow kitchen window of the family's boarding house on Calloway Street, watching the morning delivery boy make his rounds in the pale cold, and when he slipped the envelope beneath their door rather than knocking, she understood immediately that whatever was inside was not meant to be received with witnesses. Her father was still asleep. He had been asleep in one way or another for the better part of 2 years. Not always in the literal sense. Sometimes Edmund Penwick rose at a reasonable hour, dressed with old habit, and sat at the breakfast table with a cup of tea he rarely finished. But the man who had once negotiated mill contracts across 3 counties, who had built a modest but genuine name in Creston City's merchant class, who had walked with the particular confidence of someone who believed the ground beneath him was solid, that man had not returned from the winter of '87. Rosemary opened the letter herself. The language inside was not cruel. That was perhaps the worst part. It was precise and measured, each sentence constructed with the care of someone who understood that words, used correctly, were more binding than iron. The sum her father owed was printed near the center of the page, beneath 2 paragraphs of legal framing so clean they were almost elegant. $43,000. Not a number that meant ruin in the abstract. It meant the boarding house, the furniture, the 3 remaining guests who paid their modest weekly amounts in coins, they counted out with quiet apology. It meant everything that remained. At the bottom, a single line. Should Mr. Penwick wish to discuss terms, he may present himself at the offices of Bellmont Capital, 14 Harwick Avenue, at 10 o'clock on Friday morning. Rosemary folded the letter precisely along its original creases. She set it on the kitchen table, placed both hands flat on the worn wood and stood there in the silence of the early morning. Then she went to wake her father, and when she saw his face, already old in ways that had nothing to do with years, she made a quiet decision before she had even fully formed it in words. She would go herself. Bellmont Capital occupied the top 2 floors of a limestone building on Harwick Avenue, designed to communicate one thing above all else: permanence. The stone had been quarried somewhere in the northeast and brought to Creston City at considerable expense, precisely because it did not resemble the newer constructions crowding the financial district. It looked as though it had always been there, as though it intended to outlast everyone who passed through its doors. Rosemary arrived 7 minutes early, which she recognized immediately as a mistake. It placed her in the waiting room, furnished with dark leather chairs, tall windows, and the specific silence that belongs exclusively to money, with nothing to do but sit still and appear unhurried. That required considerably more effort than arriving late would have. She wore her best dress. It was 4 years old and she had let it out twice, but the fabric was still good, and the color, a deep, muted green, was not apologetic. She had stood before the small mirror in her room that morning and looked at herself with the deliberate intention of seeing what a man like Arthur Bellmont would see. What she could not change, she would not diminish. At exactly 10 o'clock, a door opened. The man who appeared was not what she had constructed in her imagination, and she had constructed quite a great deal. She had expected someone who wore his power loudly, unnecessary rings, the deliberate width of a well-fed body, a voice calibrated to fill rooms without effort. Arthur Bellmont was none of that. He was tall and lean in a way that suggested economy rather than absence. His suit was dark and very precise. His expression, when it landed on her, registered no surprise and no contempt, only a brief, quiet recalibration. The adjustment of a man who finds the room slightly different from the map he had drawn of it in advance. "Miss Penwick," he said, not a question. "Mr. Bellmont." She stood. "My father is unwell. I've come in his place." A pause, not long, but felt. "Come in," he said. His office was nothing like the waiting room. The waiting room had been designed for impression. This room had been designed for work. Papers sat on the desk, organized but present. Maps lined one wall. A single painting hung opposite the window, a northern landscape, grey and still, not decorative exactly, more like a reminder of somewhere specific. He sat behind the desk, and she sat across from it, and the space between them was exactly the width of $43,000. "Your father borrowed against the mill contracts in the spring of '86, he said without preamble. "The contracts dissolved the following year. The debt was restructured twice. We have extended considerable patience." "You have," Rosemary said. "I'm aware of that. The patience has a limit, March 15th. I know. He looked at her then, not the polite surface attention he had offered at the door, but something more direct and measuring. She kept her hands still in her lap and did not look away. What exactly, he said slowly, did you come here to offer? It was the right question. She had been preparing for it since Tuesday morning, turning it in the cold hours before dawn, when the boarding house was quiet and her father was asleep, and the world felt both enormous and suffocatingly close. My father holds a parcel of land in Harrisburg County, she said, 40 acres. The title is clean. It was my mother's, held entirely separate from the business liabilities. It isn't worth $43,000, but it reduces the obligation substantially. I'm prepared to offer it as collateral or in partial settlement. I'll defer to your preference on structure. He said nothing. She continued. I can also manage the boarding house income directly and maintain a structured repayment schedule on the remainder. Written, specific, co-signed by myself. I understand my signature carries no independent legal standing, but I'm prepared to— Your father signed a personal guarantee, yes, which means the liability follows him specifically, yes, which means your co-signature on a repayment schedule carries in practical terms no enforceability. The room was very quiet. Rosemary felt the weight of it settle, not as humiliation, but as something she had anticipated and prepared herself to absorb. No, she said evenly, not in practical terms. Arthur Bellmont leaned back in his chair, a small movement, the first one she had seen him make that was not entirely composed. Then tell me, he said, what you believe you have to offer that I haven't already calculated. Rosemary held his gaze. My name, she said, attached to yours, legally. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had come before it. This one had weight and texture. That is a considerable offer, he said at last, his voice revealing nothing, from a woman who just acknowledged her signature holds no legal force. A signature and a marriage are different instruments. He studied her for a long moment. She did not fill the quiet. She had learned in the years of managing a household held together by careful rationing of both money and words that silence was often the most powerful thing a person could choose not to break. Your father's debt, he said at last, it would be absorbed entirely. Yes, and in exchange, your reputation gains a Penwick connection. My family held genuine standing in this city for nearly 40 years before the contracts failed. That still carries weight in certain rooms, and you know exactly which rooms I mean, the ones where old names still open doors that new money cannot. He was quiet. He turned a pen slowly between two fingers, once, twice, and then set it down on the desk with the same deliberateness with which he did everything. I'm not a sentimental man, Miss Penwick. I didn't come here appealing to sentiment. Something moved across his face then. Not warmth. Not quite, but something adjacent to it, something that passed through his expression so briefly she might have imagined it. A recognition, perhaps, a faint acknowledgement that she was not what he had prepared himself for either. I'll require 3 days, he said. Of course, if my answer is yes, and I am not telling you that it will be, the terms will be written, specific, binding, without room for renegotiation. I would expect nothing less. She stood. He stood. The formality of it felt almost strange, given what had just been proposed across a desk between two people who were entirely strangers in every sense that mattered. Miss Penwick, he said, as she reached the door. She turned. The boarding house guests, a pause measured and deliberate. They'll need to find other arrangements. My wife cannot manage a rooming house. The word landed quietly in the room. Wife. As though he were already testing the shape of it, already filing it away in that precise and disciplined mind of his, already moving forward, as men like Arthur Bellmont always did, before the decision had even been made official. I understand, she said. She walked out through the waiting room, down the wide stone stairs, and out onto Harwick Avenue, where Creston City moved around her in its ordinary and indifferent way. Carriages, voices, the smell of coal smoke from the direction of the rail yard. She walked half a block before she stopped, pressed one hand briefly against the cold limestone of the building beside her, and breathed. She had gone in with nothing but her name. She had left with 3 days. And somewhere behind her, in an office designed for work rather than impression, Arthur Bellmont was already calculating. She had offered herself like a contract, clean, specific, and without sentiment. What she had not offered, and what she would spend the next several months guarding with everything she had, was the truth about why 40 acres of land in Harrisburg County had been kept so carefully separate from everything else her father had lost. That she kept, for now. The wedding took place on a Friday morning in early November, in the small anteroom of the Creston City Municipal Building, witnessed by two men Rosemary had never met and would never see again. There were no flowers. She had not expected any. What surprised her, in the quiet and unhurried way that small things sometimes do, was that Arthur Bellmont arrived precisely on time, not a minute early, not a minute late, and that when the clerk read the formal language of the civil ceremony aloud in his flat procedural voice, Arthur did not look away from the front of the room. He stood straight and still and gave his responses clearly without ceremony, and when the moment came to sign the register, he signed it the same way he did everything else, with complete and unhurried control. Rosemary signed beneath his name. The clerk stamped the page. One of the witnesses coughed, and that was the end of it, or the beginning, depending on which direction a person chose to face. The Bellmont residence sat on the northern end of Aldermore Street, in the part of Creston City where the houses were wide and the trees were old, and the distance between one front door and the next communicated without a single word that the people inside had no need to be close to anyone. It was a handsome house. 3 stories of dark brick, tall windows, a garden that had been maintained with precision rather than affection. Rosemary had seen it once from the street before the wedding, on a morning when she had walked that direction without entirely meaning to, telling herself she was simply taking the long way home from the market. She had stood on the opposite sidewalk for perhaps 2 minutes, long enough to understand that the house suited the man who lived in it perfectly, which did not, necessarily, mean it would suit her. Her trunk arrived the afternoon of the wedding. A housekeeper named Mrs. Haldren, a compact woman in her late 50s with a manner that was not unkind but was not warm either, the manner of someone who had worked for a long time in a house that did not reward warmth, showed Rosemary to her rooms on the 2nd floor. Rooms, plural, a bedroom, a small sitting area, a writing desk positioned near the east-facing window. "Mr. Bellmont takes his breakfast at 7, Mrs. Aldrin said, straightening a curtain that did not need straightening. "Dinner is served at 7 in the evening. He prefers the dining room. He does not take lunch at home." "Thank you," Rosemary said. "If you have preferences regarding the household menu, you may speak to me directly. Mr. Bellmont has no particular requirements, but he does not like waste." "Neither do I." Mrs. Aldrin looked at her then, briefly, with something that was not quite assessment and not quite surprise, and gave a small nod before leaving the room. Rosemary stood alone in the middle of the bedroom that was now hers and looked at the unfamiliar furniture, and the unfamiliar light, and the view from the unfamiliar window, which showed the bare branches of an elm tree, and, beyond it, the grey November sky pressing flat and low over Creston City. She unpacked her own trunk. She did not ask for help. The first 2 weeks inside the Bellmont house established themselves quickly into a pattern, the way all arrangements do when the people within them are either incapable of spontaneity or have made a private agreement to avoid it. Arthur left every morning at 7:30. He returned at 6:15. He read for 1 hour before dinner. Correspondence, financial papers, occasionally something that appeared to be a report of considerable length, and he ate at the table with the focused and efficient attention of a man who considered the meal a necessary function rather than an occasion. He was not rude. He was not cold in any demonstrative sense. He was simply elsewhere even when he was present, which Rosemary found, after the first several days, to be its own particular kind of difficulty. She had prepared herself for coldness, for dismissal, for the particular brand of careless authority she had seen in other men of his position, the way they made a person feel transparent, as though you occupied space without registering as real. Arthur Bellmont did not do that. He looked at her when she spoke. He responded in full sentences. He asked on the 3rd morning whether her rooms were adequate, and when she said they were, he nodded as though he had recorded the information and moved on. At dinner on the 7th evening, he asked what she had done with her afternoon, and she told him. She had walked to the public library on Merchant Street, returned 2 books her father had borrowed months ago without returning, and found one of her own. And he said, "What is it?" meaning the book, and she told him. And he said nothing further, but neither did he appear to find the answer uninteresting. These were small things. She was careful not to assign them more weight than they could hold. What she had not prepared for, and could not have, was the sheer physical dimension of sharing a house with someone who occupied it so completely without appearing to try. Arthur Bellmont moved through his own home with the quiet authority of a man who had lived alone long enough that every room had arranged itself around his habits. the particular chair he preferred by the study window, the way he stood at the sideboard each evening and poured exactly one measure of bourbon and never more, the silence he kept after 9 o'clock, which was not hostile but was absolute, a closing of the day as deliberate as the turning of a lock. She learned the rhythms. She was careful not to disrupt them without reason. What she could not determine, in those first 2 weeks, was whether he noticed that she was learning, or whether it mattered to him at all if she did. On a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of November, something shifted. It was not dramatic. The most significant things she was beginning to understand rarely announced themselves. She had been sitting in the small parlor adjacent to the main hallway, reading by the lamp when she heard the front door open later than usual, nearly 8 o'clock, which was irregular. She heard Mrs. Heldren speak briefly in the hallway, and Arthur respond in a lower register than usual, and then the housekeeper's steps retreated toward the back of the house, and there was a silence. After a moment, Arthur appeared in the parlor doorway. He had not changed from his coat yet, which was also irregular. He looked, and she noticed this carefully, the way she was learning to notice everything carefully, like a man who had come from somewhere that had required considerably more of him than he had expected to give. "I apologize for the hour," he said. "It isn't necessary," Rosemary said. He didn't move from the doorway immediately. He looked at the room, at the lit lamp, the book open in her lap, the domestic ordinariness of it, with an expression she could not read entirely. "There was a meeting," he said. "It ran longer than anticipated." She nodded. She did not ask what kind of meeting. She sensed, with the particular intelligence she had developed for reading the edges of what people offered, that the information was not the point. The appearance in the doorway was the point. "Is there anything you need?" she asked, and kept her voice even. Without warmth she hadn't earned the right to offer, and without distance she didn't intend to imply. He looked at her for a moment, just a moment, and something moved through his expression that was quieter than surprise and heavier than nothing. "No," he said. "Good evening, miss." He stopped. A brief pause, clean and specific. "Mrs. Bellmont." He corrected himself so quietly she might have missed it, and she understood that the correction was not for her benefit, but for his own. A reminder, perhaps, of what the house now contained that it had not contained before. He turned and walked down the hallway toward his study, and she heard the door close, and that was all. She looked down at the page open in her lap. She had not read a single line of it in several minutes. It was on the following Saturday that the first external complication arrived, and it arrived, as such things tend to do, with a pleasant face and no warning. His name was Mr. Caldwell Whitmore, a man Rosemary had heard mentioned twice in social connection to Arthur's business affairs, someone who occupied the specific category of associate that was neither a full partner nor entirely separate. He arrived mid-morning with no prior notice, which Rosemary found immediately and instinctively significant, because she had observed enough of Arthur Bellmont's household to understand that unannounced arrivals did not happen within it. Arthur's world was structured around prior arrangement. People scheduled themselves in advance, or they did not arrive at all. Whitmore arrived without scheduling himself. He was a broad man with a pleasant handshake and a pleasant smile, and the kind of easy social manner that Rosemary had learned, through the particular education of necessity, to hold at a small distance until she understood what it was covering. He expressed delight at meeting her. He said that Arthur had of course mentioned the marriage. He said Creston City would be very glad to welcome her into its better circles. Arthur received him in the study with a composure that was entirely normal, and precisely because it was so entirely normal, Rosemary noticed, through the partially open door, the almost invisible tension that ran through his jaw when Whitmore sat down and said with that same pleasant and uncomplicated smile, "I need to speak with you about the Harrisburg accounts, Arthur, specifically the Harrisburg land." She was in the hallway. She stood very still. The door was not fully closed. "This isn't the time," Arthur said. Quiet. Final. "I think it may need to be," Whitmore said, and the pleasantness in his voice remained perfectly intact, which made it worse. "Given the new arrangement, given what her father's land represents, legally in terms of the outstanding—" "Caldwell," Arthur's voice did not rise. It did not need to. Not now. A pause. Then the sound of Whitmore settling back in his chair, with the ease of a man who was perfectly happy to wait. Rosemary moved away from the hallway before either of them could know she had been there. She went upstairs to her room. She sat at the writing desk beside the east-facing window and looked at the bare elm tree in the grey afternoon light, and she thought, with a clarity that was almost cold, about 40 acres of land in Harrisburg County and the thing she had not told Arthur Bellmont when she had sat across his desk and offered him her name. The thing she had kept, the thing she was still keeping. She had understood when she walked into that office that secrets had a lifespan. She had simply believed she had more time before this one began to show its edges. She understood now, with Whitmore's pleasant voice still pressing quietly against the inside of her mind, that she had been wrong about the timeline, and that what had been a private risk was about to become something else entirely. Downstairs in the closed study, Arthur Bellmont sat across from a man he had known for 11 years and trusted, in the way men like him trusted anyone, which was to say partially and with clear awareness of the margins. He said nothing for a long moment after Whitmore's last sentence. Then he picked up the pen on his desk, set it down again, and looked at the door. It was fully closed now. He could not have said with certainty when that had happened. The snow came to Creston City in the first week of December, quietly and without announcement, the way things arrive that intend to stay. Rosemary watched it from the east window of her room before dawn, standing in the cold that gathered near the glass, her arms crossed loosely at her waist. The elm tree in the garden had been bare for weeks, but the snow gave it back a kind of presence. The branches holding white in the grey pre-morning light, still and particular, as though they had been drawn there deliberately. She watched it for a long time without moving. She had not slept well. Whitmore had come twice more since that first Saturday, once to the house, once, from what she gathered through the specific silence Arthur maintained at dinner that evening, to the offices on Harwick Avenue. Each visit left something residual in the atmosphere of the house, something she could not name precisely, but could feel the way you feel a change in weather before the sky shows it. Arthur said nothing about the visits directly. He never mentioned Whitmore's name in her presence, but the evenings after those visits were different from the others. The silences longer, the space between them at the dinner table somehow wider, though neither of them had moved. She was running out of time. She had known it before Whitmore arrived. Now she knew it with the specific and physical certainty of a woman standing at the edge of something with no ground visible below. The land in Harrisburg County was not simply 40 acres. That was the part she had not said. The part she had carried into Arthur Bellmont's office like a second document, tucked beneath the first, invisible, waiting. Her mother, Rosemary Penwick, had been a careful woman, careful in the way that women of her generation and circumstances learned to be careful, not through caution born of timidity, but through a precise and unsentimental understanding of how quickly the ground could shift beneath a family and what you needed to have already secured before it did. Eleanor had kept the Harrisburg land in her own name, separate from Edmund's business dealings, for reasons she had explained to Rosemary only once in the last winter of her life, with the particular directness of someone who understands they are transferring something important and has limited time to do it properly. The land has a mineral agreement, her mother had said. Signed in 79, renewed in 84. It runs another 11 years. You'll understand what that means when you need to. Rosemary had been 19. She had understood it partially then. She understood it entirely now. The agreement was with a coal extraction company operating out of Pittsburgh, a subsidiary, as it happened, of a larger industrial concern that had been quietly acquiring mineral rights across 4 counties for the better part of a decade. The annual income from the agreement was modest but consistent, paid into a separate account her mother had established in Rosemary's name alone, which Rosemary had kept active and kept quiet through everything, through the mill contract collapse, through her father's slow unraveling, through the boarding house and the letter with the burgundy seal, and the walk up Harwick Avenue in the November cold. It was the only thing she had kept for herself. The problem, the specific, pressing, dangerous problem, was this: if the land transferred to Bellmont Capital as collateral or settlement, the mineral agreement transferred with it. The income from that agreement, modest as it was monthly, was the only financial independence Rosemary Penwick had ever possessed, or was likely to possess. It was not a fortune, but it was hers and it was real, and without it she would be entirely dependent on a man she had married across a municipal desk 6 weeks ago and still did not fully understand. She had withheld that information when she sat across from Arthur. She had told herself it was because the agreement was her mother's legacy, and she was not yet certain of the terms of its transfer. She had told herself it was because the amount was small enough to be genuinely immaterial to a debt of $43,000. Both of those things were true. Neither of them was the complete truth. The complete truth was that she had been afraid, not of Arthur specifically, but of what it meant to enter a room with absolutely nothing held in reserve. She had watched her father negotiate from a position of total exposure, and she had watched what happened when the ground shifted. She had decided the night before she walked into Bellmont Capital that she would not make that same error. Now Whitmore was asking about the Harrisburg accounts, and somewhere in those questions was the shape of what she had not said. Arthur found it on a Thursday. She did not know precisely when or how, whether it was Whitmore who had located the mineral agreement through his own research, or whether it had surfaced through the title documentation her father's attorney had submitted as part of the debt restructuring. It didn't matter in the end how it surfaced. What mattered was that at dinner on a Thursday evening in the second week of December, Arthur set down his fork with a quietness that was different from his ordinary quiet, and he said, without looking up from the table, "The Harrisburg land has a mineral rights agreement." Rosemary set down her own fork. "Yes," she said. The dining room was very still. The fire in the corner grate made its small sounds. Outside, the street was muffled by snow. Arthur looked up then. His eyes were steady and gave nothing away, but there was something behind them that she recognized as the specific expression of a man who has been precise his entire professional life and has just discovered that precision was not mutual. "You didn't mention it," he said. "No. When you sat across from me in November and outlined what the land represented as collateral," a pause, "you didn't mention it." "No," she said again. She did not apologize. She had decided somewhere between the east window at dawn and the dinner table that she would not open with an apology, because an apology would immediately concede territory she was not certain she was willing to concede. "The agreement generates income," he said. "Modest income, monthly, into an account in your name. My mother established it. The land was hers. The account was hers, transferred to me, before the debt, before the debt." He looked at her for a long moment. She held it, not comfortably but steadily, the way she had held his gaze the first time in his office, with the specific discipline of someone who understands that looking away is its own kind of statement. "You came to me," he said slowly, "with a proposal. You outlined the assets available. You were specific about the land's value in the context of the debt." He stopped. "And you omitted a mineral agreement that has been generating income for 10 years. "I did." "Why?" The question sat between them. She could feel the weight of it pressing on the table, on the silverware, on the small remaining distance between who she had been when she walked into his office and who she was now, sitting across from him in his dining room in his house with his name. "Because it was the only thing I had," she said. "That was entirely mine." The silence that followed was the longest one they had shared since the wedding. Not hostile. Nothing about Arthur Bellmont was ever simply hostile, but weighted, full. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, and it took her a moment to identify it, because it was the last thing she had expected to see there. It was not anger. It was not the cold, professional withdrawal she had braced for. It was something that looked, around its careful edges, like understanding. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he picked up his fork, looked down at the table and set it down again. "The agreement," he said. "What are its remaining terms?" 11 years from 84, so 9 years remaining. Transferability clause. Requires consent of both original parties. The extraction company would need to agree to any transfer of the counterparty. He absorbed this. She could see him absorbing it, the way the information moved through that organized and precise mind, finding its place, being filed. "Then it cannot simply transfer with the land title," he said. "No." Another silence, shorter this time. "You understood that when you came to me in November." "Yes." He stood from the table, not abruptly. Nothing Arthur Bellmont did was abrupt. He rose with the same controlled economy of movement he brought to everything, and he walked to the window that overlooked the garden, where the elm tree stood snow-covered in the December dark. He stood there for a long time with his back to her, and she sat at the table and waited because there was nothing else honest to do. Rosemary. He had not used her given name before, not once, in 6 weeks. The sound of it, spoken in that quiet and undemonstrative voice, did something unexpected to the air in the room. "Yes," she said. He turned from the window. He did not cross back toward the table. He stood at the distance the room allowed, and he looked at her with an expression that had shifted into something she could not fully map, something that sat between professional recalibration and something older and less organized than that. "Whitmore knows about the agreement," he said. "I assumed. He's suggesting it represents a concealment that voids the terms of the debt absorption, that the marriage contract was entered under incomplete disclosure." She felt the cold of it move through her chest, clean and swift. "Can he argue that legally?" she said. It was not quite a question. "He can try." Arthur's voice was even. "He has a financial interest in the Harrisburg land that predates our arrangement. He's been working toward acquiring those mineral rights for 2 years. The agreement with your mother's counterparty is the obstacle." He paused. "You are the obstacle." The fire in the grate shifted. A log dropped, resettled, threw new light across the room. "Then he doesn't want the debt resolved," she said slowly. "He wants the agreement voided. He wants the land clear of the mineral contract so he can—" "Yes," Arthur said, "and if he argues that the marriage terms were entered under incomplete disclosure, it creates a legal question about the validity of the debt absorption, which means the original liability potentially reasserts." He looked at her directly. "Against your father." The room was very quiet. Rosemary sat with the information settling over her the way the snow had settled over the city, quietly, without announcement, covering everything that had been visible before. Her father, $43,000, a personal guarantee signed in '86, the ink of which had never stopped being real, regardless of everything that had come after it. She had kept the mineral agreement to protect herself. She had not calculated with sufficient care how quickly that protection could become a weapon, pointed in a different direction entirely. "What are you going to do?" she said. Arthur looked at her for a long moment from across the room. This woman he had married across a municipal desk 6 weeks ago, this woman who had walked into his office with nothing but precision and nerve and one carefully kept secret, and something moved through his expression that was too controlled to be called feeling, but was not entirely without it either. "I don't know yet," he said. It was the first time in 6 weeks of careful and measured coexistence that she had heard him say those words, and somehow in the specific silence of that December dining room, with Whitmore's ambitions pressing quietly against the walls from the outside, and the fire burning low in the grate, those 4 words, "I don't know yet," were the most honest thing they had said to each other since the day she had walked through his door. She looked at him across the room and felt for the first time the genuine and unsettling sense that they were standing on the same side of something. She was not sure yet whether that made it better or worse. Somewhere on the other side of Creston City, in a well-appointed office that faced a different street, Caldwell Whitmore was reviewing a document his attorney had prepared. He was not a man who acted carelessly. He had been patient for 2 years. He was prepared to be patient a little longer. What he was not prepared for was what Rosemary Penwick, Rosemary Bellmont, was going to do next. Neither, for that matter, was she. The meeting took place on a Monday morning. Rosemary had requested it herself. Not through Arthur, not through any attorney, not through the careful social machinery that men like Whitmore preferred to operate within. She had sent a note directly to Whitmore's office on Saturday evening, in her own hand, on plain paper with no crest and no ceremony, asking him to meet her at the offices of Bellmont Capital at 10 o'clock on Monday. She had not explained why. She had not needed to. Men like Caldwell Whitmore did not decline invitations from women who had stopped being afraid of them, because curiosity is a more powerful engine than caution, and Whitmore was, above everything else, a curious man. Arthur had read the note before she sent it. She had shown it to him. He had looked at it for a long moment, looked at her and said nothing. Then he had given her a single, barely perceptible nod, not of permission, but of something closer to recognition, and handed it back. She had sent it that evening. Whitmore arrived at 5 minutes past 10, which was deliberate. He settled into the chair across the desk in Arthur's office, with the practiced ease of a man who had made himself comfortable in other people's spaces his entire professional life, and he smiled at Rosemary with the full warmth of someone who believed he had already won. Arthur stood at the window. He did not sit. He had agreed when she outlined what she intended to do, to be present and to be silent. Both conditions had cost him something. She understood that. She was grateful for it in a way she did not yet have the language for. "Mrs. Bellmont," Whitmore said pleasantly. "This is unusual." "Yes," Rosemary said. She sat behind Arthur's desk. She had not asked permission to do so. She had simply sat there when she came in, and Arthur had gone to the window without comment. "I'll be direct with you, Mr. Whitmore, because I think you prefer it even when you pretend otherwise." The smile remained. "By all means." She set a document on the desk and turned it to face him. "This is a letter of correspondence between your firm and the Harrisburg County Extraction Company," she said, "dated March of '87, 4 months after my father's mill contracts collapsed." Whitmore's smile did not disappear, but something behind it shifted. "In it," Rosemary continued, her voice even and unhurried, You propose acquiring the mineral rights to the Harrisburg land contingent on the resolution of my father's outstanding debt to Bellmont Capital, a debt which, at that time, had not yet been made public, and which your firm had no legitimate access to through normal channels. She paused, which means someone provided you with that information privately, before the restructuring, before any public filing. The room was quiet. Outside, Creston City moved through its ordinary Monday. That letter, she said, establishes that you had prior knowledge of my father's financial position through a source inside this firm. It also establishes that your interest in the Harrisburg land predates any legitimate claim by approximately 19 months, which means your current argument, that the mineral agreement represents a concealment voiding the marriage terms, is not a legal position. She looked at him steadily. It is leverage, built on information you were never entitled to have. Whitmore was quiet for the first time since she had met him. The pleasantness had not entirely left his face, but it had thinned considerably, and beneath it was something harder and less composed. "Where did you find that letter?" he said. "My mother," Rosemary said, "was a careful woman. She let that sit. The truth was simpler and more human than drama required it to be. Eleanor Penwick had corresponded with the extraction company's principal officer for years, the kind of steady, practical correspondence that careful women maintained and that careful men routinely underestimated. When Whitmore's firm had made its approach in '87, the principal officer had forwarded the letter to Eleanor as a courtesy, flagging it as something she ought to be aware of. Eleanor had kept it. She had kept everything, and she had left her papers in the end to the only person she trusted to know what to do with them. Rosemary had found it in December, 3 days after the dinner, where Arthur had stood at the window and said, "I don't know yet." She had gone back to the boarding house to collect the last of her mother's correspondence boxes she had moved there years ago for safekeeping, and she had read through them with the specific and unhurried attention of someone who understands that the answer is probably already written down somewhere. If a person is willing to look carefully enough, she had been right. "You have 2 options," Rosemary said. "The first is that this letter reaches the appropriate parties, including the 3 other firms whose mineral rights negotiations you've managed in this county under similar circumstances, and you defend your methods publicly." She folded her hands on the desk. "The second is that you withdraw your legal challenge to the marriage terms, release any claim on the Harrisburg land and its mineral agreement, and conduct your future business in this city without further involvement in the affairs of this house." Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Arthur, who had not moved from the window and whose expression was the same careful and unreadable thing it always was, except that she knew him well enough now to see, in the set of his jaw, something that was not quite pride, but was close enough to it to matter. Whitmore looked back at Rosemary. "You would have made a formidable opponent in another life, Mrs. Bellmont," he said. "I'm a sufficient one in this one," she said. He picked up his hat from the edge of the desk. He stood. He did not extend a hand, and she did not offer one. He walked to the door, and he paused there for a moment with his back to the room, and then he left without another word. The door closed. The office was very still. Arthur turned from the window. He looked at her across the room, across the desk he had sat behind for years, the desk she was sitting behind now, and his expression had moved into something she had no practiced name for, because she had not seen it on him before. It was open in a way his face was not accustomed to being, unguarded in a way that had clearly cost him something to allow. He crossed the room. He did not move quickly. He stopped at the edge of the desk, and he looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the silence between them was not heavy or weighted or full of anything unresolved. It was simply quiet, the way things are quiet after something has finally been said that needed saying for a long time. "Rosemary," he said. "I know," she said. She did not know precisely what she knew, but it was true regardless. He reached out and set his hand over hers on the desk. Not dramatically, not with any of the ceremony the moment did not require. Just set it there, steady and warm and deliberate, the way Arthur Bellmont did everything when he meant it entirely. She turned her hand and held his. Outside on Harwick Avenue, Caldwell Whitmore walked into the cold December air and hailed a carriage and did not look back at the limestone building behind him. His legal challenge would be quietly withdrawn by the end of the week. His reputation in Creston City's financial circles would contract slowly and without announcement, the way reputations do when the ground shifts beneath them. He would continue to operate. He was not a ruined man, but he was a diminished one. And in a city built on the precise calibration of power, diminishment is its own kind of ending. Inside the office, Arthur Bellmont, the most legendary investor in Creston City, the man who had built an empire on calculation and control and the absolute refusal to be surprised, sat on the edge of his own desk beside the woman he had married for her name and looked at her with the expression of someone encountering, for the first time in a long time, something he had not calculated in advance. He found he did not mind. The empire did not fall that December. But the man who had built it, cold, precise, unassailable, was never quite the same again, and neither was she. Which was, in the end, the only thing that mattered.